In this video, we're going to talk about creating control curves for your freeform surfaces. Let's start by selecting Freeform and selecting the top face of our rectangle in our freeform face part. Once you've selected the rectangle, you'll notice that you get a mesh preview on the screen. This mesh preview is the orientation of our coordinate system. This means that any control curves we add are going to have to be aligned with this coordinate system. So let's go ahead and hit the Add Curves button just to see what we get on the screen. So you'll notice the green preview. As we move this around, the location that you click will be where you place this control curve. If you hit the Tab key or select the Flip Direction button, you'll rotate that 90 degrees and align it with the other direction in our mesh. If you need to modify this orientation, you simply need to select User Define for your coordinate system and manually rotate that. So you can see the preview on the screen as we're dragging this around to different angles. We get a preview of the new orientation of our mesh. Now when we select Add Curves, they're going to be along our new directions. This has a big effect on how the curvature is created. Before we go there, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can control our curvatures. So if we modify our continuity from contact to movable, we can simply use any of the boundary curves as a control curve. To modify the geometry of our control curves, use the handles just as you would with a spline. You control the direction and the weight of curvature induced at the edges. With movable selected, when we rotate this around, we can actually move this around in 3D. But if we select OK, we're actually going to be trimming the surface location of this plane. So even though we're pulling this outside of the border, the resulting surface is still going to be trimmed there. Let's go ahead and change this back to contact and start with the original edge. So to add a curve using the Through Points option, let's go ahead and just place one in the middle. Once you're finished creating your control curve, you can either hit the Add Curves button again or hit Escape. Now by selecting the control curve, you can modify its geometry. Now it's important to note whenever you're viewing this, you want to view it in a plane or a normal view to the direction you want to modify. Because we actually can move this around in 3D off the plane, we can easily create some unwanted geometry if you're not careful. So let's go ahead and move this back to our normal plane and start modifying the geometry. So as you can see, this is an easy way to change the curvature of our part. But one thing you might be noticing is that we really don't have precise control over this. If you were trying to create a precision surface, you would most likely be better off by creating the sketches and creating either a boundary, filled, lofted, or swept surface to create this type of geometry. Freeform surfaces have great benefit when you're creating organic shapes that don't necessarily have to be fully defined. Later on in this series, we'll talk about using control points and lining them up with a previously created sketch. Let's go ahead and add a few more control curves. Simply by selecting Add Curve, we can place multiple curves in here, hit the Tab key, and place curves in the other orientation. Now we can select these curves and modify their curvature by selecting the handles and moving them around. One thing you'll notice is the curvature is restricted at other control curve intersection points. For instance, if we move these other control curves around, they need to follow the curvature at the surrounding control curves. Another thing you'll notice, in contrast to the original curve we added, anytime there's an intersection between control curves, there's going to be a control point automatically added. We can manually add control points by hitting the Control Point button and add it anywhere along our control curves. By hitting Escape, we deselect the Add Points button and we can manually move this point around. Hopefully you can see that it's very easy to create complicated geometry, but it's also very easy to get overwhelmed. By selecting a curve and hitting the Delete key, we can remove it as well. So that way you can go back to an earlier version by removing the curvature that was created. So now we have a single control curve, but the resulting control points are left where the intersection curves were. If you accidentally drag a control point or a control curve curvature to an extreme angle such as this, you can use the Undo button and move back to a previously created point or curvature. This is why I say it's very important to look at these curves in a normal type view. If we wanted to modify this curvature, it'd be best to be looking at a front, a side, or a top view to make sure that you're not accidentally dragging these points in 3D space, such as this. That concludes our first video on control curves.